Hello and welcome to OrbitCon on Sunday morning. This panel is Creating and Finding Progressive Secular Content Online. This panel will feature podcasters, YouTubers, and bloggers who create progressive secular content. Guests will discuss the challenges in creating such content, ways viewers can find, support, and elevate such work, and perhaps start their own shows and blogs. Christy Winters, go ahead and enjoy your time.
Well, thanks so much. And thanks to everybody who's come to watch our panel. I want you to know that if you have questions for the panelists or for me, you can ask them not by going to the chat, because there isn't a chat for this program, but you can go to the link in the description box below. That will take you to this panel's page, and you can submit your questions via the form there. Alternatively, if you go to Twitter and use the hashtag OrbitCon, you can mention the panel and your question on Twitter, and Benny will be on the lookout for those on the hashtag feed as well. So I would like to welcome my two panelists. We're missing our podcaster for technical reasons, but hopefully she will be joining us in the very near future, or at least before the end of the panel. But I would like if the two people who are on the panel, I can't see their bios, and they've very kindly agreed to introduce themselves via their bios. So we'll go in alphabetical order, and I'll start with Christiosity. If you'd please like to introduce yourself to the audience.
Hello, it's Christiosity, and according to my bio, and this is correct actually, I'm a feminist agnostic. I create videos and blogs about feminism, politics, agnostic spirituality, art, movies, and music. And on Twitter, I am the president of the No Charity for Eugenicists Club. So there you go.
So look for her on Twitter. And my other panelist today is Steve Shives. Steve, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Well, according to my bio, which is also correct because I wrote most of it, I am a YouTuber, but not one of the rich, awful ones. I am a social justice advocate. I am a progressive atheist. I try to do good, and I produce social commentary and smartassery of a generally respectable quality, sometimes with stuffed animals.
Very good. Well, thank you guys both for coming on to talk on this topic, which I've tried to make multifaceted. And is that? Oh, hey, welcome.
Ina's here.
Hey,
sorry for being 3 minutes late, but it took me.
No, it's okay. Actually, you were just coming in at the end of the introductions. And Steve, since Ina is joining us a little bit late, are you still on the page where you could give her introduction so we can wrap up the panel introduction?
I can get right back to it.
Okay, thanks. Or Christiosity or whoever has it on. You were the last one, so I thought. Yeah.
No, let's go. So Ina is a woman, writer, illustrator, and podcaster of Pakistani Muslim background who often critiques religion, both the far right in the East and the West. While she critiques Islam, she loathes anti-Muslim bigots.
There we go. Fantastic. So welcome to our panelists. Thanks for being on. To get us started, I'm going to ask a question, and the format of this is going to be kind of like a round table because nobody's got PowerPoint presentations. We're speaking from our experience here or things that we've learned from watching other people and other content. So I'll be asking the panelists the same question and then allowing them the opportunity to ask questions of each other before moving on to the next question. So the first question to each of you is, the phrase progressive secular content can cover a lot of things. To start, can each of you say what you consider when you hear the phrase, progressive secular content? And again, I'll start off by going in alphabetical order. So I'm putting Christiosity on the spot, and then I'll go to Ina, and then to Steve.
Okay, so what I think of is, first of all, I think of the progressive part as being somebody who has a sort of humanist point of view or respect for different types of people, diversity of people, who prioritizes marginalized voices, who considers the ways that we can sort of move forward in society and do better, be more just, more socially good for more of the population than is current. And I also, and the secular part to me is about at the very least respecting the different roles that religion plays and where it shouldn't be. You know, as an agnostic person, I always say that I'm not really all that interested in different people's religious or spiritual beliefs, provided they don't try to impose them on other people or put them into this public sphere in a way that's just inappropriate or infringes on other people's rights. And so I think that in our world today, that is a very important line to keep in mind. We can see in governments like the American government that it does get awful blurry and people start to cross it, so I think it's a very important principle of our society to keep that. You never want God and king to be the same person. So that's the way I see it.
Right. Thank you for that. Ina, welcome. How are you doing today? We haven't had a chance to really bring you into the conversation yet.
Yeah, I'm doing well, aside from the ice storm outside.
Yes, you're getting hit with quite severe weather.
Yes.
Quite a large area. I know my family's from Wisconsin, and there's a lot of reports of blizzards and whiteouts and inches of snow.
I'm just happy to have power still and, be able to join the conference.
We are very happy to have you. So with that, do you need me to repeat the question, or are you ready to give your answer?
No, I've got it. So
Okay.
I agree with everything Chrisiosity said. And I'd just like to add that I think it's something clearly distinct from this, this alt-right, light, adjacent, anti-SJW, anti-left stuff that we're seeing is so very fashionable nowadays. I think it's content that is trying to advocate for those with little power versus content that fights for the status quo. And I'd say the secular part of it, for me, means, keeping religion and state separate. As an atheist, I'm a pretty, I'd say, pretty strict critic of religion, but I've pulled back on that a bit recently because of how I've seen it sort of cross the lines into bigotry towards all adherents of religion. So I definitely say that progressive secular content is aware of the distinction.
Right. Thanks for that. Now, Steve, you're last, and then I might just give some concluding thoughts and then open it up for cross questions. So go ahead.
Yeah, I want to sort of pick up a thread that Ina mentioned there in her remarks about there's two halves of it. There's secular and there's progressive, and they're both equally important. I was at a conference last week. I was at the Secular Social Justice Conference, and there was a little bit of talk about religion and secularism, and there was a lot of talk about politics and social issues and progressive causes. And the thought occurred to me, my problem with the religious right is not just the religious part. It's the right part too. The right wing part. Like I object to both halves of that, and I have problems with both halves of that. And so with secular progressive content, I think it needs to recognize the value of both things. Where yes, secularism is very important to us. Most of us are atheists or agnostic, or we at least have respect for the principle of religious pluralism and of secular government, where there's a separation between church and state. That's incredibly important. But social progress is important too. Social justice is important too. Equality is important too. And they're of a piece with each other. You can't have one without the other. If you want to have a secular society, you should want to have an equal and just and fair society as well. And so secular progressive content is content that, to me, it's not just explicitly atheistic stuff. It's not just people talking explicitly about atheism or critiquing religion or challenging religion. It's people coming at whatever issue they care about from that secular and progressive point. You know, these are my priorities. This is how I view the world. These are the things I think are important. These are the things I think should change. And you're approaching it from that secular progressive stance and giving voice to that point of view.
Right. Thanks for that. So I just want to confirm the echo chamber by saying I agree with all of the previous speakers. And I think you guys have really expanded on the variegated nature of what this term together would mean. And I think the only contribution I can make at the end is to bring up the last word, which is content, and the fact that progressive secular content doesn't have to be people lecturing you about how you should experience white guilt or some nonsense like that. You know, as Steve was saying in his last bit, building on what the others had said, these values can permeate a lot of different your creations, your work, whether it's a comedy show or a historical show or a documentary or a critique of news. Part of the progressive secular content, in my opinion, is seeing how events or history or how you can bring these things in your comedy, these progressive secular values as well. And so it doesn't always have to be on the front burner. It can just be, you know, one joke in a video about something else, really, or in doing a history video or looking at something from history, making an effort to look at it from an intersectional point of view, and being aware of that and consciously bringing that to your content. So it's, I think the content side of it, I wanted to emphasize what I see as partially, you know, already existing. There is some comedy, there is educational stuff and other things. But when people are thinking about making secular content or progressive secular content or things that could be counted as, I think we can also think across genres and maybe challenge ourselves into the way that those values also be informing what people make across genres. Yeah. So in going back, does anyone on the panel have a question for anyone else or want to bring up a point they made and expand on it?
I guess
Yeah.
I'm interested in, because you talked about content and art, and I understand how that comes forward in some art. I wonder if it's and I'd like to talk to Ina and to another degree Steve, who does his show Steve and Stuffy. Like, do you ever feel like there's a tension when you're doing art or, you know, writing a script? Do you ever feel like, oh, I'm not sure if I'm approaching this right, or this, I shouldn't do this, or I'm just wondering.
Yeah, I mean, I'll always, you know, try to think of what I've created from a bunch of different points of view and see if there's any flaws in the reasoning and stuff. Like, I mean, I think it's pretty natural to second guess what you're creating to some extent, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I know for my part, like when I'm writing a Steve and Stuffy video, there are definitely, you know, there are definitely jokes that I won't do, and there are areas that I don't go into because I don't want to be like needlessly offensive. You know, I mean, my philosophy when writing stuff like that is, if I'm going to offend somebody, I at least want it to be intentional. You know, I don't want to just throw something out there recklessly and have it hurt someone's feelings or piss someone off inadvertently that will, you know, cause them to not enjoy what I've done or to not get the point I'm trying to make or whatever. So I try to be very mindful of that stuff. And it's just, you know, everything comes from your point of view. And when you write something, whether you're writing like a political monologue or you're writing a comedy skit or whatever, I think that it's very important that your point of view as a writer comes through, because that's what gives each individual piece its own personality. That's what makes things stand out. That's what keeps it from just being wallpaper. And so my point of view is someone who cares about secular issues and cares about social justice issues. And, you know, I try to make sure that that comes through, even if I'm doing just a silly little video where I'm talking to stuffed animals and arguing about cultural minutia. You know, if I can come up with a joke that will send a message about how, yes, you know, it's great to be an atheist, but it's also good to not be a jerk to religious people for no reason, or to denigrate religious belief itself for no reason. You know, I try to slip that in there, you know.
Mm-hmm. For me, I think a big part of, I guess, evolving was trying to contextualize the discussion around Islam and realizing that you're not necessarily surrounded by good faith critics. So in my community's context, I would be, you know, punching up against the Islamic right wing. And I think it's a fair fight and you can go heavy on that. But in the larger context, there is the aspect that, you know, there are Muslims are a minority in North America, and maybe always harshly criticizing Islam has to be done with care and done strategically to make sure that the Western far right doesn't latch on to your talking points. Like, you know, I'm a pretty harsh critic of the hijab and burqa and niqab, and I started realizing the kinds of people that would be retweeting my, you know, illustrations. And even though I put in like, this is not, you know, not for you xenophobes, it's very hard to get them to like delatch. So you have to be mindful of that, I guess, and see how it can be used.
You know, that one more thing real quick, that's a really good point, and it brings up the idea of, you know, when you write or when you talk or whatever you're doing, to be mindful of who your audience is.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that I have really focused on over the last 4, maybe 5 years of my stuff, because I realized on YouTube, most of the audience for what I do is fellow atheists. And I realized if I'm talking mostly to my fellow atheists, what is it that I want them to hear from me?
Mm-hmm.
Do I want them to be like, you know, guy number 851 who's telling them how awful Islam is? Or do I want to give a different point of view? Do I want to say, yes, it's possible and important to critique the extremist parts of Islam, just as it's important to critique the extremist parts of other religions. But, you know, it's also important to, as you said, to keep in mind that in our culture, in our society, in North America, that Muslims are a mistrusted and often mistreated and marginalized group of people, and that they're not a threat, that they're parts of our communities, that they're people who live among us and have been a part of our country for hundreds of years, and they don't deserve to be vilified. So yeah, I think that's very important too, to keep in mind who it is you're talking to.
And I think this is what a lot of ex-Muslims sort of miss the mark on. So in the context of, you know, Islamic theocracy, or someone in Saudi Arabia or someone in Iran getting frustrated with the oppression and burning a Quran, for example, I think that's a, you know, understandable and brave act, maybe, you know, dangerous. But if I was in Pakistan, I'd be like, you know, go for it, fight the power. But to transplant that over here in an anti-Muslim climate and say, you know, and sort of encourage burning this, you know, oppressive book, it can lead to some troubling things happening. I don't think it's a good idea.
Yeah.
Right. So if it's if you guys feel like this came to a natural conclusion, we'll go on to the next question. Now, I think that in the interest of flow, I noticed that when you guys are done, you stop speaking, and then there's a pause. And I don't always know the difference between a pause because you're thinking and a pause because you're done. So maybe what is best is I'm going to start the next question with Ina, and then it goes to Steve and goes to Curiosity. And Ina, when you're done, just hand it over to Steve. And Steve, you can hand it over to Curiosity. One, it means I have to do less work as a moderator, which is nice, but also means that if the flow of it there won't be any of those pauses. So the second question is really more autobiographical. You know, progressive secular content, as we've seen, takes many forms, and you guys each have your own way of doing it. Can you say a little bit about what motivated you to make content that is, progressive secular content, and how much of your work do you consider explicitly PSC? I'll say, to stop saying this long phrase over and over, and how much of it is implicitly PSC, and how much of it is absolutely just not related to progressive secular content value at all. So yeah, starting with Ina.
So I started off thinking about this after 9/11, and basically wanting to start a two-pronged discussion. One, we're in a Western, so I started writing about Pakistani sexuality and just generally sexuality in the Muslim world. And I had lived in Pakistan for a couple of years. I had done like a few interviews while I was there, and just been surprised by the amount of misinformation about very, very basic things that we would take for granted over here. So I started blogging about that, and to me, it was always progressive in intent. I wanted to do it, firstly, to fight back against Islamic conservatism that was, trying to control people's sexuality, and also to sort of humanize Muslims in a post 9/11 world by discussing a topic that isn't really discussed in relation to Muslims very often. And then as it progressed, I talked more and more about how religion plays this role in controlling people's sexuality. And then I found myself in the atheist movement. And then I started seeing my words and my work being used to sort of generalize Muslims, and not really for the purpose that I had intended it at all. So I've been, especially, after Trump's been elected, I've been really rethinking a lot of things. So I don't know, to me, it was pretty obviously progressive in its intent, and I don't know how people can turn that around and use it for right-wing purposes, but there's that being of a minority religion factor there. So I've always been pro diversity. Like, my first children's book was called My Chacha is Gay, which is about a little boy and his uncle in Pakistan, and how his uncle is mistreated for being gay, and how the little boy doesn't understand because he's the best uncle in the world. And I was always very clear about my goals about South Asian representation in the media and things like that. And then all of a sudden I find myself in this group of people that are like anti-diversity and anti, representation doesn't matter and things like that. It's like, I'm like, how did I end up here? I don't know. It's been a strange journey. So, I mean, that's really, I don't really know what percentage I consider explicitly progressive or implicitly progressive, but I hope that covers the question. I'm going to hand it over to Steve.
Definitely.
Yeah, I started making YouTube videos my first video was actually a response video, and it's weird because I never make response videos ever. I think I've made maybe a tiny handful of response videos in my entire YouTube career, and I've made thousands of videos at this point. And but it was responding to a Christian YouTuber asking questions for atheists, and I responded to it because it seemed like the questions were in good faith. It seemed like the questions were interested in what I had to say, or interested in learning about the experience of atheists, or the opinions or the thoughts or the worldview of atheists. And I thought, that's interesting. And it's not combative, and it's not gotcha, and it's not, oh yeah, well, if you don't believe in God, then explain this. It wasn't like that at all. So I entered from that direction. And I think that sort of influenced me a little bit in coming at, with my secular content, coming at religion, not in terms of, look how silly this is, look how wrong this is, how foolish are people to believe these things, but rather coming more at it from a conversational point of view, from a point of view of, wanting to understand, wanting to share my point of view with people, so that people who don't come at things from an atheist perspective can see what I'm saying and see where I'm coming from, and have some little bit of understanding about what someone who is an atheist might think, or how they might see the world. And the progressive thing, became more important to me when I saw how unprogressive so many other atheists were who were making content, especially on YouTube. I always sort of considered myself, or at least not always, but at least since about halfway through high school, when I grew out of my young Republican phase. Yeah, well, I had one. But since then, for all of my adult life, easily, I've considered myself a more left-leaning progressive person. I've always cared about racial equality and gender equality. I've felt like in the abstract that those things were important. And so when I saw other people who were making content on YouTube as atheists, talking down feminism and attacking racial justice activists and saying out of line things about Muslims, in a way that I felt went far beyond the border of, well, we're just critiquing their religion. That it became important to me to do something else and to say, okay, well, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do the opposite of that. I'm going to show that you can be an atheist, a very outspoken, unapologetic atheist, but not denigrate religious people, not be anti-social progress, not be anti-feminist, not be anti-racial justice, or not go into a rage at the mention that I, as a white person, might have privilege, things like that. I thought that became very important to me. And the more I did that, and the more I sought out other people doing that content, the more I realized that even though I cared about those things and felt that they were important in the abstract, I had so much to learn. And I had so much distance yet to travel. Like, just because I could say as a man, oh yeah, feminism is important, that doesn't mean I know what I'm talking about, or that I understand the issues, or that I know what my place in the conversation should be. There's all kinds of things that you still have to pick up. So that's been an important part of my development as a content creator, is learning my proper place in all of these conversations, and learning more about the things that I had no idea about when I started, with nothing but my good intentions, saying, well, I want to support these things. These are good things. And as far as how much of my content is explicitly progressive secular, most of it, I would say, probably is explicitly. Almost all of it is explicitly one or the other. And most of it is explicitly both. Like, I do a series, my Atheist Read series, where I review Christian apologetics books, and that's obviously very explicitly secular. And it's implicitly progressive, and if I can find a natural jumping off point to make some commentary about a progressive issue within that context, I'll do it. But yeah, I guess the Stephen Stuffy videos where I'm just talking to stuffed animals are probably implicitly progressive and secular, because I do think my point of view on those issues comes through, but it's not always explicitly the point of the videos. But most of my stuff, I would say, is explicitly one or the other, and often explicitly both progressive and secular. So I'm done rambling. Chrisiosity, what do you have to say?
Well, I have to say that when I came on, and I guess I'm one of the youngest, or not youngest in terms of age, but youngest in terms of making content, because I've only been at it for a couple of years. I came on innocently or naively, thinking, I think that, when I saw some things out there that, oh, I can make content that will help here, will be helpful to sort of this atheist secularist movement. One thing was that many of the atheists who came out had either come from very patriarchal, very sort of strict fundamentalist varieties of religion. And it seemed to me that there was that most of the atheists had almost nothing to say to anybody who came from a different kind of tradition. So I felt like that I could sort of fill that gap, because I never came from a fundamentalist or a traditionalist sort of religious background. And in fact, I had a period of a few years where I was very into what atheists would call woo, sort of new age philosophies. And there are some things that really need critiquing in there. There are things that can really get people into trouble, but the approach that most atheists would take to somebody who is very like hardcore fundamentalist just wouldn't work. So, sort of, and on the same level, I do believe that religions and spirituality were created by humans for humans, and that there is a lot of good in there, and you can't just necessarily slam the door on that. There's still beneficial information. What the problem is, to me, when it sort of crosses the line into believing just not true things, or believing things that there's no evidence for, and is just putting too much of your sense into that. I when I talk about spirituality now, I'm not talking about a belief system. I'm talking about a sort of a practice of living in the world that provides an experience of the world that is more loving and more kind and more peaceful, or that sort of prioritizes those sorts of empathetic, naturalistic sorts of things. But at this point, I don't believe in anything supernatural whatsoever. I don't have any concept of anything like that, and I don't think that those concepts are necessary. I think that they're harmful, So this is a very long-winded way of saying that I was hoping that I could fill a gap that I thought needed to be filled. And that didn't happen because I think that the atheist movement has become extremely rigid. And unwilling to take any criticism, unwilling to sort of bend in any way. It's like they're on their atheist train and they're just going, and it's not working, and it's starting to fall apart for them. You can see it. And that's what a rigid thinking echo chamber, lack of flexibility will do for you, I think. You should never be quite so convinced of your own rational brilliance. So so that was where I came from, and I think that it's still a part of what I do, that sort of secularist position. At the same time, it is, it's kind of, because I haven't gotten a lot of feedback that that's something that people want or need right now, I've sort of gone away from that aspect, and just sort of gone more into the strictly progressive feminist sorts of things, it's needed on YouTube right now, as sort of a balancing out of what has become far too far right, alt-right, alt-light, too much of that content, which people, I think, are mistaking the popularity of that content on YouTube as meaning it's very popular in the world and everybody's on this. And I don't think that's it. I think that there's a small group of people who are sort of an underserved niche market of assholes that didn't have anywhere else to go, and YouTube filled that little market and became this sort of behemoth on YouTube. And then it started bullying everybody else off, with all these YouTubers that were going after much smaller, much more gentle-natured people who didn't expect it to, come at them this way. So I feel like I needed to come and sort of bring up and say, you know, I don't care. You can, I've been dogpiled so many times now, I could give a crap, but, but, you know, it has been interesting. Let's put it that way. And I think that's me. That's all I got.
Okay, great. Well, I'll answer very briefly. I want to echo some of the points that Christiosity about coming into it naively made, and Steve about what you've learned from it. Because I came on wanting to bring a sort of feminist critique to atheism before I realized that feminism, if you try to use it as a critique of atheism, you're ruining atheism. But when you bring science in to discredit you know, creation stories, that's absolutely fine. One theoretical process is okay, but not another one. But most of my stuff, yeah, unless it's my travel videos, it's either political, like Steve mentioned, or about religion and looking at it from that way, from a secular perspective. But what Steve said that I really resonated with was this idea of how much I've learned since becoming involved. And that was not something I thought about at the time. I started my channel because, like Christiosity, I had views I wanted to express. But, you know, I also focused a lot on feminism because I grew up in a very small town. I'm white. I'm like the second most privileged person you can be in America. You know, if I was a white man, then that was the only sort of difference, you know, that I could get in terms of that. And I lacked a lot of, I have friends who are from a variety of you know, backgrounds. But I've never been a minority in a population. I've never, you know, been in a situation where I was in a room with my friends and I was the minority in terms of my ethnic background. And one thing that I've learned in learning to try to be a good ally is always the first step is to listen and hear what people are saying, and not just listen to kind of like, you know, listen to stuff for entertainment, but really try to understand where they're coming from and internalize that. And that experience is something that I've gotten through being on YouTube and meeting other people in the progressive community and in the cool people on the secular side of the progressive side of the secular community. And so I'm learning too, just like Steve, that I'm in a process and there are still things that I could probably improve on, and I need to be open to that and reconsider things and make sure that I'm not too rigid in my thinking and always be looking to move forward, to be progressing. So with that said, I want to kind of keep the questions to this section short, but does anyone have any questions to the other panelists that they want to ask right now?
No, you covered a lot of ground.
Yeah. All right. Well, the next one might be a little bit faster, and I'll start with Steve, and then he'll go to Christiosity, and then go to Ina. First, considering the positives, and then we'll do the negatives. Can you first give 3 points of advice to somebody wanting to begin a channel in like sort of like a positive perspective from it, like, and then if there's like negative warnings you want to give, we'll do those later. So, Steve, can you start us off?
Yeah, sure. I think one of them is something that I've already mentioned earlier, which is, at least at the beginning, have a solid idea of who you want your audience to be. If you decide to start making content, you should have an idea in your head of who you're writing to or who you're speaking to. And that doesn't mean to pander to those people, because another piece of advice is make sure that you know who you are and make sure that you know what you want to say and why you want to say it. Like these are very basic questions that we often sort of overlook. And if you don't settle this stuff early on, then you have to figure it out as you go along. And that can be painful and embarrassing for everybody involved. But you need to figure out, if you're going to start making content and you're going to share it with the world, you're going to publish it, you're going to start a blog or a podcast or a YouTube channel or whatever. Who are you? Where are you coming from? What's your point of view? What do you have to add to the conversation that other people aren't saying? What do you want to talk about that other people aren't talking about? Or how do you want to talk about issues that other people aren't talking about? What do you have to add? And who are you talking to? Who's your audience? Who is your audience likely to be? Who do you think you will be talking to? And how do you want to address yourself to that audience to get your point across most effectively? What do you want from this when you start making content, when you start writing or producing or what have you? What is it that you want to get from this yourself? Because I think that's important, because if you are thinking about starting to make content and whether you're making progressive secular content or any kind of content. If you're getting into it hoping that you'll just be praised, and people will just celebrate you for, sharing your wisdom or your wit or whatever with them, you probably shouldn't do it, because unless you are extremely fortunate or a rare genius who is just universally praised, that's not going to happen. People are going to, no matter how many people love what you do, even if you're very fortunate and you attract a very receptive, very appreciative audience, there will always be people who will absolutely hate what you're doing. Sometimes because it's just not their taste, sometimes because they are politically opposed to what you're trying to do, sometimes because they're offended by you for some other reason, legitimate or not. There will always be people who will absolutely loathe you and everything you do. And because it's the internet and it's so easy, they will tell you how much they hate you and how much they don't appreciate what you're doing and how destructive what you're doing is, or how pathetic you are, or you can go down the list of things they will say. So know who you are, know what you're doing, know who you're talking to. These are very important things that you need to at least have thought about a little bit in your head before you start, excuse me. And the negatives, I kind of touched on the biggest negative already. People will not like what you do. Some people will not like it, and you have to be prepared for that. And you have to be prepared to not necessarily take all of that personally. You can't avoid taking some of it personally. And if people attack you personally, if people, if you are fortunate enough, as I think all of us on this panel have experienced at one time or another in the past, to be the target of online harassment or abuse, dogpiling, there are people who will not like you, who will not like what you're doing, and will make a target of you and will try to incite as much misery in your direction as they possibly can. And it's not guaranteed that will happen to you if you become a content creator on the internet, but especially if you become a progressive content creator, and most especially if you become a progressive content creator and you're creating content that is originating from and directed to a largely atheist audience. Unfortunately, there is a very vocal section of the online atheist community that engage in that sort of online harassment and abuse very, very eagerly. And they will let you know where they are and let you know how much they think you suck. And it's important, I think, to be able to withstand that. But at the same time, you also have to acknowledge that, sometimes it will get to you. Sometimes it will hurt you. Sometimes it will hurt your feelings. Sometimes it will discourage you. Sometimes it will make you question why you're doing this. And before you start, I think it can help to keep that in mind so that you're not taken by surprise. So that when you do put up a podcast or a blog article or a video that really, really pisses people off, in a way that you didn't necessarily intend, or in a way that isn't necessarily fair to you, that you're ready for that you have at least anticipated it, even if you're not actually ready for it, because you're never really ready for it until it happens to you. But at least you've anticipated it. You can, oh, okay, this is that thing that I knew was going to happen, because I'm talking about feminism, or I'm talking about, being religiously tolerant, or I'm talking about whatever. And there are people out there who think that those things are evil and wrong and will attack me just for saying it. So those are some pieces of advice I would have, is basically, as best you can, know what you're getting into in every possible way. Know what you want to say, know why you want to say it, know what you want out of it, and be ready as you can, at least to the point of having anticipated it, for the awful garbage that will be coming your way, simply for opening your mouth and sharing what you've had to say. So, Christiosity, what do you think?
Well, I totally agree with you. I think having a strong sense of who you are and what you think is right and wrong is very important. Otherwise, you're just going to be yanked around by the winds of the internet, just blowing you around. So, but if you know who you are, you know what you're about, and a lot of times people will come at me and there'll be some sort of argument or drama. And then I just have to remember to sort of sit back and say, what do I think is right? And what do I think is not right here? And then that's it seems like an obvious step, but I do think people forget to do it. Let's see. What I would say, in addition, a couple of pointers is to watch content or listen to content, whether that's podcasting, if you want to do blogging, read blogs, if you want to do YouTube, watch videos, develop a sense of yourself as a fan, see what's out there, see what you like and what you don't like and what people are doing. And, be open to experimenting. I try to get a little better at making videos, which is, I'm not the greatest editor. I'm not the greatest person at the technical stuff, but I try to learn a little bit and do a little bit better and sort of just work on that a little bit by little bit by little bit. So those are two things I would say, watch the kinds of content that's out there, be a fan, and be open to experimentation. Know that you're not going to be perfect right away. It's going to be, there is a learning curve to this, and that's all there is to it. I've never met a single person who said, you know what, I came out with my first video, it was just exactly how I liked it, and it's been nothing but perfection ever since. It's not happening, and everybody I know is very hard on themselves, very hard on their techniques, can blatantly see what you're doing wrong, have trouble giving yourself kudos for what you're doing right. So, just sort of keep in mind that those are all things that are going to happen, and you're just got to do the best you can. And develop friendships. One of the great things about YouTube, there are a couple great things about YouTube that I think that we should all be grateful for. One of them is that at no time in all of human history has it been so easy to express yourself and to create content and send it off into the world and, find people from all over the globe who feel the way that you do and think the way you do and can form a community with you online. Like that used to be, back when I was younger, if you were in a conservative town, then that's who you got to talk to. Like there's no such thing as I'm going to talk to the people in Germany who are really progressive today. Like you didn't get to do that, right? So I think that, having gratitude for those options and for having the ability to do that is just great. And now I feel like I'm starting to just completely ramble, but so I will move it on to Ina.
Yeah, I mean, I think both of you have said stuff that I completely agree with and would have said as well. I think it's important to know, what you stand for, and rather than hinging your identity solely on being against something, maybe create content that stands for something. And I think that's a problem that we have generally in the atheist movement. So yeah, definitely try to keep that in mind. And if you're coming from an interesting or unique perspective, see if you can, really focus on that. Like how Chrisiosity said that she wanted to fill the niche of not coming from a fundamentalist background in the atheist movement. I do think that's a unique perspective, because we do hear from a lot of people who are, who have grown up with fundamentalist backgrounds, who are, angry in a way that a lot of people can't understand. So there's got to be someone that speaks to the people that haven't grown up with fundamentalism. And I kind of relate to that too, because even though I grew up in Saudi Arabia and was exposed to a lot of really batshit crazy fundamentalist stuff on a daily basis, like, I mean, I've encountered morality police and canes and shit. But at home, my family, for a Muslim family, is very liberal, very progressive. My dad was very secular, even though he's a practicing Muslim. He was very against like the hardcore Salafist interpretations of Islam, and he was a great role model for me. So I think, that's among a lot of the ex-Muslim perspectives I see, I think that's a different one that I can bring to the table. So, you know, if you think you've got a different story to tell, go for it. What else? I think that you can take a lot of comfort in the fact that you're standing up and giving a voice to people that may not necessarily be able to do that. If you're a progressive content creator, you're standing up for people with less power, and that's a good thing. As for the negative things, I think Chrisiosity and Steve touched on those. Definitely be prepared for the resistance you'll face, especially if challenging the status quo. Be prepared for the dogpiling, the absolute hatred. And if you're a person of color, a minority, a woman, be prepared for that to be even worse. But I think if you go into it knowing, then you won't be taken by surprise. So it's always good to understand what you're getting yourself into. And now I think I'm just repeating what's already been said, so I'll leave it there.
Well, we do have a
Right.
couple of
Benny?
questions. Yeah, we've got a couple.
Yeah,
Of
sorry.
questions.
Were we doing 60 minutes or 90 minutes? I thought we were going 90 minutes.
Oh, if you know what, I may have been mistaken. So let me.
Oh, just checking.
Well,
that's what I requested, but I didn't.
Yeah, so let me put this question out there, and then I will go and check, because I'm happy to do either one.
Yeah, go ahead.
But it's very related to what you've already been talking about, so I actually feel like it's well connected. We have somebody who's thinking about doing content creation for the first time, and says that they are looking at doing something either on YouTube or a blog format, but they're really new to both formats. And so what I'd love to hear is some resources from y'all. Like, how did you learn how to do the things that you did? What are some places that we can point new folks to deal with like technical questions and the like how to come up with content kind of questions? I'd love to hear that from everybody.
Rapid fire round, lightning round.
Yeah, I'm just going to say that I'm like a big technophobe, so I did not see myself editing and creating a podcast at all. I would just say that don't let that intimidate you. If I can do it, then anyone can do it. I think if you just Google the technical questions, if you have relationships on Twitter, you can just like put the question out and see if someone will help you. There's lots of YouTube videos that you can watch. So yeah.
Yeah, and I would just say also, as specifically about YouTube, because I don't have a particular resource to point people to either. As Ina said, Google is your friend. Like if there's something you don't know how to do, take the initiative and figure out how to do it yourself. And the basics of making YouTube videos are pretty simple. You know, if you have a decent camera, and a lot of people, if you have a smartphone, you probably have a better camera than the one I started making YouTube videos with. And that can be, you can start with that. And if you have a decent lighting, and it doesn't have to be professional photography or videography lighting, if you just have decent lighting, a decent microphone, a decent camera, and you know what you want to say, and you have a strong idea of what you want to make your content about, then that's good enough to start. And you can build from there. If it becomes something that you get good at, that you want to keep doing, that you want to take a little bit more seriously, then maybe you can invest some money in getting some better lights or a better camera or a better microphone. But for the beginning, the starting equipment is actually shockingly easy to get your hands on and to learn how to use properly. And most of your basic technical questions that you would have can be answered just with, a couple minutes of Googling. There are lots of really good resources, both videos that you can actually watch to go through things step by step, and articles that you can read to explain, what is a good entry-level microphone if you want to start a podcast? What is a good entry-level camera if you want to start making YouTube videos? I would say definitely look into those, and just trial and error. Just make a video, edit it, finish it, watch it. Do you like it? Did it turn out the way you thought it would? What can you? It's a lot like the writing process. You know, you write a draft, you read it, you look at it, you think, okay, that didn't turn out the way I thought it would. What do I need to change? And you can either do that over and over and over again for a single work until you get it good enough that you want to share it, or you can make a video, put it up, you know, make a podcast, put it up, let people listen to it, and then take your feedback on board and say, okay, next time, for the next episode, I'm going to do this differently. And the more you do it, the better you'll get.
If Christiosity, do you have any points? Otherwise, I'll jump in. Yeah, you go ahead.
Just quickly, I would say, don't be afraid to ask people that you have maybe been a fan of or seen online. They may or may not have the time to devote a lot of time to you, but most of the people that I talk to are more than willing to help you out. Or, you know, people come to me and they say, oh, I'd like to do this, and what would you recommend? And I always, you know, tell them to the best of my knowledge, and, you know, I'll pass them along. You know, I like to put up small people that are just starting out, that are doing something interesting or cool. So just, you know, don't be afraid. Don't be shy. We're all in the same boat here. We were all convinced we suck and are amazed that anybody watches us. And so it's all good.
Yeah, my points would be, first, Audacity is a great free audio program. So if you have a camera on your phone and it records audio, or on a webcam, and you don't like the sound, it's a great free program you can use to improve it and get rid of the background noise, make your voice fuller, and let it so it doesn't sound like you're doing it in a boxy room, right? There are free, easy technical things to do. But more importantly, just have good content, and that's easy to say, right? So what's a more helpful piece of advice than have great content? My advice would be, when you turn on the camera, have a point already decided in your head that you want to make. You know, don't turn on the camera and think your way to the point. If you're going to be reacting to a news article, know what points you want to make before you turn on the camera, and find your way to that point. Even when Kevin and I do the happy hours, you know, we set them up in advance. We talk about the stories that we're going to cover. We agree to them. We do the reading, and I have a take when I come on air. And what we do on air is all spontaneous, but I know what I'm going to say before I go on air, if that makes sense. So I think one of the ways to have good content is to have really clear points that you get across to your audience in a succinct way.
Oh, I have one more thing you reminded me of, Christy.
Yeah.
Edit ruthlessly. Unless you're doing like a live event where you can't edit, but even then, try to self-edit, try to get to the point as efficiently as you can. But if you're pre-recording stuff, if you're doing podcasts or videos, or if you're writing blogs, edit ruthlessly. I've talked to people in the past who have told me kind of proudly, oh, I don't edit for content. You know, I only edit if there's like a big mistake. I don't cut content out. And if all the content that you recorded is brilliant, that's great. But personally, you know, especially if I'm making a video where I haven't scripted it, because if I've scripted it, then I've edited the script before I get in front of the camera with it. But if I'm just doing a video where I'm just speaking off the cuff, and as Christy was saying, I have an idea, I know what the video is going to be about, I know what my point is going to be, but I'm sort of riffing. When I get that video out of the camera, I cut it down as much as I possibly can. I am not under the impression that my every word is wisdom that the world deserves to hear. You know, if I speak for 30 minutes off the cuff about some subject, if I can't whack that down to a 20-minute video at least, maybe even shorter, then I don't feel that I'm doing my job as a presenter. So be willing to edit. You know, there's a phrase in writing, murder your darlings, which means even if you're writing a piece, and even if you write a sentence in a story and it's your favorite sentence that you've ever written, but it doesn't work for that story, get rid of it. Don't be so attached or so precious about anything you've created that you're not willing to do without it if it will help the overall piece. So that's another thing that especially beginning content creators kind of lose track of. Edit.
Put it in like a director's bonus clips package.
Yeah, if you're that attached to it, yeah.
I'd like to apologize if anyone can hear the ice pellets hitting my window.
Oh no, but oh, it sounds so cold. Right, so I don't know where Benny's. He's given us more leave, I guess. So I'll move on to the next question. Oh, there he is. Hello.
You've got plenty of time. So I was incorrect.
Okay.
You've got 90 minutes, but you can even go past that for a little bit if you need to.
Well, Benny, we appreciated the question. It was very well timed, as you said. So the intervention was a happy ending, sort of after all. So thanks for your help.
Excellent. I'll talk to you again in a bit.
There's no drama in this panel. Someone's got to like insult someone or say something really horrible.
Oh, I'm sorry. We're being so darn civilized.
Yeah. What the hell kind of atheists are you?
Nobody's reading offensive things from the chat, and nobody will watch this. Right. So this question might be quicker, because I could only think of one good piece of advice for it. So I'll see what you guys came up with. It's quite easy to find status quo secular content online, but how have you found progressive secular content, and what tips do you have for people looking for more? Sorry, I think we're back to Curiosity starting now, and then to Einid, and then to Steve.
It was a little hard to find it at first, and so what I did is, I can't remember who was the first person I found that did progressive secular content, but I went to them, I watched their stuff, and then I looked at their subscriptions and just started hitting them until I sort of had gone, and I did that for a while, and that's how I found. Oh, I think Captain Andy. He was the first one I found. That's who it was. So then I just went to whoever he was subscribed to, whoever he was watching, and then from there it just dominoed out. So, and even if you're not making content, comment on videos or leave a little note or say a little something. And just sort of get yourself out there, because we do read our comments. We do look at the people who are communicating to us, and so that's a very beneficial aspect, I think, of what we do, is that we have this capacity to get a relationship with our audience. And that's me. So, Ina?
Yeah, I mean, at first I was like really confused by the conservatism in the atheist scene. Like, really, I didn't understand what was happening. Like, I'm like, I left this behind in Saudi Arabia. Why are there people hating on feminism all the time? Why are there like anti-diversity rants all the time? This is so strange. I thought this is like, I mean, this was the reason that I started questioning religion in the first place. So, the bigotry, the sexism. So it was just absurd to me and I kept thinking that, okay, maybe I'm making a mistake or judging people too quickly. So, I stuck it out, watched people closely for a few years, and now I'm like, wow. So for me, finding some progressive people, which happened really more so on Twitter. YouTube's not really my world. And even though these aren't like video creators, I would like to give a shout out to Tom Bloke and Classic Liberal on Twitter. They really, really restored my faith in the online secular community, because really it was starting to feel lonely. And then they I think Tom Bloke recommended ContraPoints to me. From ContraPoints, I found Sean and Jen and H-Bomber and Curiosity. I came across also, just from watching videos on YouTube, I think it was Curiosity's criticisms of Dave Rubin that helped me find her, and Gad Sad. So I think one thing is to learn to recognize what status quo atheist content looks like. Even sometimes it comes masked, and it can really throw you off, as it did me, because you're like surrounded by all these people who say they're on the left or who call themselves liberal, and you're like, what? You know, so starting to see through some of the, I guess, some of the signs of that, starting to see through the lies, people who say they support Me Too, but they spend their entire time bashing Me Too, people who say they're against anti-Muslim bigotry, but all they do is prop up anti-Muslim bigots. You can't go by the words people are saying because they're lying. So you have to learn to figure out the signals and learn to understand who people are associating with. And that'll help you filter out a lot of terrible content and help you find better, actually progressive, actually left-leaning content. And then, you know, once you find a couple of people, just, yeah, as Christiosity suggested, just see who they recommend, see who they're tweeting about, see who their subscriptions are, and you're bound to find more. And that's it for me, I'd say.
I'll just pick up on something that Ina just said, and it sounds a little unusual at first, but I just want to give a shout out to Twitter because because Twitter, both the best and the worst thing about Twitter is that anybody can just come swooping in at any time, and you know, there is an element of Twitter, even with the expanded character limit, you know, that Twitter is a format where people, yes, you can sometimes be misunderstood. You can sometimes be, you know, do a very bad job at expressing yourself or getting your point across. And, you know, that's something that we all have to be mindful of and be charitable towards others for if that happens. But Twitter also has a lovely way of allowing people, sometimes without them even realizing it, to show you exactly who they are. And that's a great way of identifying people or helping to identify people that maybe you shouldn't be paying so much attention to. In the blow ups in the atheist community last year surrounding MythCon, and this year surrounding the Lawrence Krauss allegations, and now the David Silverman allegations, it's a great way to see who's reacting in what way, and to say, oh shit, I didn't think that's what he would think about this. Maybe I should take another look at you know, at paying attention to this person or taking this person seriously. And the other side of that is, yes, I know, I'm pretty sure I found you on Twitter. I'm pretty sure that I saw someone retweeting something of yours, or saw you interacting in a thread with somebody else that I knew. And that's how I found you and found your podcast. And that's how I found a lot of people.
And I'd just like to say that the way I found you is to see how upset you were making some status quo atheists. And I was like, who is this person? And are they really terrible? And I'm just gonna, you know, investigate. And I'm like, okay, what's wrong with this person again? So, and then I started following you. So
thanks, shitty people on Twitter. Well, but it's, you know, you and Kat Black and Francesca Ramsey, and I have this list of awesome people who I am personally acquainted with now to one degree or another, because of just that. Because they saw people just losing their minds about something I said, and they thought, I've never even heard of this guy. He can't possibly be that bad. And, you know, and it turned out that actually we get along. So yeah, Twitter is a good way to, you know, if you can sort through the garbage and you can sort through the nastiness, you can find people. Look at who is replying to who. Look at who is retweeting who. If you like someone who does host a podcast, or they have a YouTube channel where they host hangouts, look at who they're talking to. Look at who their guests are. Look at whose shows they are guests on. You know, that's a really helpful thing too. See who's collaborating with who. Because the thing is, when us progressive secular types, when we find each other, you know, we like to collaborate. There's a lot of collaboration. There's a lot of cross-pollination, or even if we don't collaborate directly, there's a lot of boosting each other's signals. You know, oh, Christy had an awesome hangout the other day. Here, check this out. You know,
not enough, I'd say.
Oh, there should always be more. Yeah, I agree with you. We should do a better job. And I know I should. Yeah. Personally, but yeah, but look who people are promoting. Look who people are talking to. That's a great way to find people.
And the other way around too, I'd like to say, especially when it comes to ex-Muslims, progressives will actually like forgive a lot of things that they wouldn't, like, you know, in another secular claiming to be liberal, say white person, if they're like extremely anti-feminist or something, or trying to like join hands with far right groups. But when it comes to ex-Muslims, I've seen a lot of people just overlook that, and it boggles my mind.
You know, I've actually been in that situation. Because of the, I guess, a lot of the anti-Muslim rhetoric that floats around in atheist circles, and but also because ex-Muslims have been so championed and so held up as, you know, look at these, you know, we should be listening to these people. They're telling us stories that we haven't heard, you know.
But listen to them only if their ideas are good, right?
Oh,
you gotta be able to use your critical thinking.
Absolutely, and that's what I mean. It has taken me. I think I'm there now. You know, I've figured it out. You start to sort of, you tune into the dog whistles, you know. But like for me, you know, it took me a while to figure out, like, oh shit, yeah, they're an ex-Muslim, but boy, they're kind of shitty, you know. Like their opinions are like, if an ex-Christian were saying these exact same things, I would think, oh wow, that's an asshole. And it took me a while to get there, you know. So I think you're absolutely right. You're describing something that I have experienced, where it's like, if it was someone coming from another background, I would have been much quicker to recognize the problems with some of the things they were saying.
Yeah, yeah. Among the atheist scene, there's this sort of, I don't know, endless forgiveness and charity for someone who's ex-Muslim, even if they're like, I don't know, waving flags with white nationalists or saying Judaism is worse than Nazism. I think, you know, really, Dave Rubin has helped expose a lot of this stuff. So thank you, Dave Rubin. Just look, and not in a good way. So before someone thinks
in a slightly ironic, ironically thinking way.
So I mean, I think if you can overlook Dave Rubin softballing and being a propagandist for the alt-right as an ex-Muslim, then you're really not really holding true to your liberal principles. And it's probably a pretty good indicator that people should look more carefully at what you're saying. If you're like BFFs with Christina Summers, you're not exactly you know, fighting for women's rights here. So.
And I, you know, it does break your heart sometimes. Like, it broke my heart a little bit when the Women's March would not simply say Louis Farrakhan is a fuck.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, that's not that hard. When he's saying the most anti-Semitic things you could want to hear, that's not what we should be aligned with, and fuck that.
Right,
like,
but you see people on the atheist scene are happy to call that out because it's the left making an absolute terrible mistake and should not be given a pass on, I say. But atheists are happy to call the left out on that. But calling people within the inner circle, calling atheists who do the same kind of shit, or ex-Muslims who do the same kind of shit, that just doesn't happen. That is so resisted.
Yeah, I don't understand. Like, I don't understand why anybody cares about Majid Nawaz, what that guy says. Like, I don't. At this point, but boggles the mind.
I'm a former fan of his. Like, I used to really, 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 really respect him, and I've seen him either change massively, or I don't know, woken up to something. I don't really quite understand what's happening, but I think, he's gone in a strange direction.
So I'm going to bring this back to the main question. Sorry, because we've got about, I think we're getting on to the Q&A time here, and I've got one more question I want to get through. So thank you for that interesting conversation. I'm going to say the tip I have for finding new content is look up a topic that you care about. Now, for instance, I was looking for reaction videos on the Lawrence Krauss situation, and through that I found videos by a channel, Gothic Intellect, and she had some really great videos. I haven't had time to look more into her oeuvre, her body of work, but sort of I found that was a way to find somebody, because it's a very new channel, and you know, the recommendations don't give you those small channels all the time. So even just going on YouTube from a YouTube perspective and looking up a topic and looking to see what people are saying about it, you might find some new progressive voices. So the last question that I have, and then Benny, I'm sure will reemerge in the next couple of minutes with more questions, is about the role of the audience. So do you, and this will be going to Ina first, and then Steve, and then Christiosity. And remember, we're on limited time. Do you view the role of the audience is there to consume your content or political, progressive secular content? Or do you think that there's more that can happen in that place or that interaction?
Yeah, I think definitely there's a lot more that can happen. And if you want to keep encouraging the content creators that you love the content of, I think it's very, very important for the audience to leave comments, give feedback, be vocally supportive, make some noise. Right-wing content creators get so much of that. I don't think that the left is as good, and I think that we do take some stuff for granted. I think that there's a lot of, but people are supposed to be saying this stuff because this is the right stuff to say. But that's, people are putting themselves out there and putting themselves in the way of threats and, hate. So it's always nice if you can do more than just be a silent consumer. And that doesn't necessarily mean like financially supporting. You can just be vocally supportive. Sometimes I say that, I don't know why I do this, because some days it gets the toxicity and the hate becomes so much, but then I'll get some nice comments or some encouragement, and that helps. So that's it for me.
I would say, yeah, I can definitely second that. I as someone who gets a lot of negative feedback, the positive feedback helps tremendously, and it can help if you are someone watching this who you have like a favorite podcaster or a favorite YouTuber or blogger. It really makes a difference to just take a few minutes and say, yeah, this was really well written, or this really meant a lot to me, or I'm going to share this with somebody. This made a point that I thought was important. Like that it helps hugely. It's tremendously encouraging. And from the other side, as the content creator, I also think it's important, especially in sort of the extremely defensive environment that a lot of people find themselves in when they are content creators. If your audience or certain members of your audience tries to tell you that you've done something wrong, or that you have gotten either you've said something that wasn't correct, or that you've been insensitive, or that you've said something that maybe you shouldn't have said, or that you didn't realize what you were saying, or whatever, if they're calling you out for something, be open to that. Don't just automatically get defensive. Don't just automatically go to the place of, well, you're taking me out of context, or you're mistreating me, or that's not what I meant, or you're being uncharitable. There will certainly be times where people in your audience will make critiques of you or challenge you, and you will think, well, that's not fair. Like, that's fine. You don't have to agree with every critique your audience makes of you. Then you'll completely lose your own voice and your own personality. There are times where you have to plant your feet and say, no, actually, I stand behind what I said. But there will also be times where someone from your audience will say, well, I wish you hadn't said that, or I think you could make that point in a different way that wouldn't alienate this group of people over here, or I think you're being unnecessarily hurtful, or I think you failed to consider something. And they will be right. And instead of getting defensive and insisting that you don't have to change, or you don't have to take other things into consideration, it's better for you, for your content to grow and evolve and get better, and also for your relationship with your audience to say, you know what? Yeah, you were right. I'm sorry. I didn't think about that. Or from now on, I'll try not to do that. I've had to make a couple of course corrections like that in the past. A lot of content creators who I admire have had to do that. And I would much rather follow people and listen to people and read and watch people who are willing to admit when they've made a mistake, or admit when they have spoken before they thought, or whatever, and been willing to acknowledge that and change course and apologize and say, you're right. Thank you. Thank you for pointing that out. I'm going to try to do better, than someone who will just hold their breath until they turn blue and refuse to admit any wrongdoing. And in doing so, end up rallying a lot of animus and negativity toward the person who was, bringing the subject up in the first place. So that's important too. That's my piece.
I'd just like to say I totally agree with everything that people have said. The only thing I would add is, I mean, I don't think of the audience as passive consumers at all. I think of them as people who are with me on this journey or part of this community, in whatever way that they want to be. You know, I just don't think of them as just people who sit there and stare at a screen. Like to me, we're all of a piece. And I think that's because of the political nature of what we do. You know, other things maybe would be different, but because we have sort of values that we're expressing through the things that we watch, through the things that we recommend, through the things that we comment on, through the things that we support, you know, like that's all just part of a movement to me, even if it's only a tiny little movement or just like on the fringes of this movement. It's still, you know, put your shoulder to the wheel. Let's go. Let's push. You know, let's go left. That's it.
Right. And then if I could, Benny, just my own, yeah, thanks, Curiosity, my own advice, or at least request to audience members who appreciate this content that you're watching, share it. You know, put it on Twitter, put it on Facebook, tell people about it. The thing that the status quo atheists have against us is that they have massive audiences, and by comparison, we have very small audiences. And so by sharing something you enjoyed, or sharing something that someone who you admire, and maybe not every show is for you, but if you put it in your Twitter feed, maybe somebody else who is interested in it will find it. That is a sort of a form of slacktivism, but you know what? It's a great form of slacktivism that I heartily endorse. So that would be my wrap up. And then, yeah, handing it over to Benny.
Sorry, can I just add one little point here? Adding to your point where you said the status quo atheists have a large audience, and I just want to say that, you know, it's sort of structurally set up to be that way. When you're fighting for keeping the people in power, you're going to have more people in power on your side. When you're fighting for the powerless, you're not going to have as many people on your side. So, you know, the leaders in the atheist movement, mostly being status quo atheists, that's the kind of content that they endorse and promote. So it's sort of an uphill and unfair battle, but that's why I think that progressive lefty atheists do need to do a bit more to share and vocally support such content. That's it.
That's fantastic. So I do have one more question from the audience that I'd love to hear y'all address. And it's about sort of the definition of secularism. So I'm going to read it out as it stands to make sure that the question is asked correctly. It says, I'd be curious about the panel's thoughts on secular people who aren't specifically atheists, and if they should be included within the secular movement. I've dealt with several people within the movement who believe that the most you can be outside of atheist is agnostic, but you cannot be anything else and call yourself secular. It feels highly reductionist and exclusionary to me. So I'd love to hear your perspectives on that, on how we sort of define the secular community and what is sort of inside and outside of that.
Why don't we go in the same order we were going to? And so Steve starts, and then Curiosity, and then Ina.
I favor open borders. So if a person, and this is something that I've sort of come to again over the last few years as I've been more involved in the progressive part of the secular progressive movement. I think that if you are a person who does not identify as an atheist or an agnostic or some other label that might be more traditionally acceptable by atheists, but secularism is important to you, religious pluralism and religious equality is important to you, separation of church and state is important to you, then I don't see any reason why you shouldn't feel welcome with us. You know, there are people who are who in their religious belief are of a certain religion, are Christians or Jews or whatever, but they also consider secularism to be a very important thing. They recognize that a secular society is the best setup for people of all religions, because they realize it's important that one religion not be allowed to have an unfair advantage over other religions or of groups that do not have a religious identity, that you don't want a situation where one religious group has more influence with the government or has more control with the government than another group, that's not a fair setup, that the only fair setup is to have equality so that you're free to believe and practice however you want under the law, and other people have the same freedom and have the same rights and have the same opportunities. And if you happen to believe those things and think those things are important and believe in social progress, believe in social justice, but you're not an atheist, I personally don't see why I'm trying to exclude you. You know, if you can help us accomplish what we want to accomplish and push the wheel in the direction we want to push it, but you don't identify as an atheist, that's the least important thing in the world to me. I don't think secularism necessitates atheism. I think if we agree on more than we disagree, as far as I'm concerned, I would like to try and be a friend and an ally to you and see what we can accomplish together. But that's just my opinion. As I said, I favor open borders. So, Christianity, what do you think?
I think it's really actually essential that this movement, stop focusing so much on specifically atheism, and start looking at what our real goals are, like, because when you look at the nuns, the rise of the nuns, most of the people who are not religious are also not people who would call themselves atheists. And part of that is because there's this movement out there that has sort of convinced people that atheism is about being a dick to religious people. So we don't want that anymore. Like it's kind of important we not just be that, and bizarrely, because of that also, it seems as if the atheist movement has actually been anti-secularist in many cases. I cannot imagine a worse sort of a worse ticket than the Trump-Pence ticket if you're an atheist secularist to put forward. And yet many of the very popular atheist leaders were like, oh yeah, we like these people.
YouTubers specifically, right?
YouTubers specifically. And it's like, that's ridiculous.
Sorry, we're at the 3-minute mark, and I want to make sure Ina has an opportunity to respond.
All right, go ahead.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, I think that it really depends on how you identify, right? If you want to participate in a secular movement and you're a theist, I don't think it's anybody else's business to stop you. If you think secularism is important, which I think it is to some theists, then go for it. But the atheism movement, which we see is fragmenting, and that's sort of narrow, and a lot of atheists too feel unwelcome there. So I think it's up to you what you want to participate in. I have known theists who are kind of questioning and curious, who are interested in atheist content, and I don't think it's anybody else's place to tell them that they don't belong here. You may feel unwelcome by all the religious mockery, but I think it's up to you. That's it.
All right.
Me.
Well, great. Thank you very much for that. I will just say in closing that my perspective on this answer is that if a person holds the opinion that private religious beliefs, which they are entitled to hold privately, but they are not sufficient in and of themselves as a basis for public policy, right? That separation between church and state. If anyone has an opinion, they are to me like a secularist, and they are my ally. Like they are a person I will want to work with to achieve our common political goals. So if they identify as Christian or New Age or agnostic atheist, that's irrelevant to the point of us sharing this common goal. So Benny, how are we for time?
We're just about at that time. I want to thank you all so much for being here and having this wonderful conversation on OrbitCon today. And I do want to encourage our audience to check back in a half an hour, and the next panel will be starting. We have a little bit of a lunch break. And thank you all so much. I'm going to go ahead and end this now, all right?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.